So good evening, everyone. Hope everyone is well tonight. I doubt I'll take the full extent of time of 20 minutes. This brother, I think, is going to be way doper. So I'm ready to hear what he has to share. And also, I think it's important to make sure that we allot enough time to engage you all. This is a really important discussion to weigh in on, I think, in general, but I think even more so now as we kind of consider the current political climate. I think I'm pretty confident saying that most folks here are of the political persuasion of fuck Trump. So, and I think that's the right political position. But I think one thing that would be favorable to us, to Trump, that his kind of open racism, open sexism, open xenophobia really seems to present a opportunity for folks of different, identity categories to kind of coalesce together and think about what does this particular brand of right-wing populism mean, right? And I think this pot has been brewing for some time over the last few years. You consider Occupy that gave way to a Black Lives Matter movement. There's been a significant amount of activity in the street, which is good. And I think for folks who've been involved, and even if you take a look at what you see out in the street via social media, you'll see a diverse mesh, of folks, which is cool, visually. Now, when people get to talking, then you will hear all manner of politics espoused, some productive, most not so helpful, right? So the task that we have in front of us, given that we're in a climate that seems to engineer to produce lots of spontaneous activity that's bringing lots of folks together, how do we occupy those spaces and put the right types of politics in front of folks, that we turn these moments into really grounded movements that are operating under the right principles, the right paradigms, the right theories. And one of the things that we want to advance tonight, that the right way to go is, a politics of solidarity, right? That people have a vested interest based on their class position, right? To fight back against the state, the ruling elite, and what matters most is this linked fate that we have as workers, right? So my mentor, Gregory Myerson's here, and one thing that he says is that the manifestations of oppression are many, right? The cause is singular, right? And that's class oppression, right? So how do we go about with the class analysis of oppression? Then we can understand racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and all of these other things as symptoms of the main social antagonism, which is that of class, right? The ruling class, those who own the means of production, against the workers, those who are forced to sell their labor in order to survive, right? One thing that the ruling class has been brilliant about is keeping us divided at the bottom, keeping us pitted against each other, at each other's throats, while their coffers continue to consolidate and they get more wealthy, more powerful, and you have white folk blaming black workers blaming immigrants, straight against LGBTQ, et cetera, and so what we want to challenge and confront tonight are these schisms, talk about ways in which our linked faith as workers is the best way to organize, the best organizing precept, so we can mount the type of strength and power that we need to confront the ruling class. Singularly, we just won't get it done, right? It's not going to cut it. So we have a vested interest, to Na's point, not just because we're good people or it's morally the right thing to do. We have a vested interest to stand with immigrants, right? We have a vested interest to stand with the oppression that's being mounted against LGBTQ folks. White folks have a vested interest to confront anti-black state violence and white supremacist racism and things of that nature. Because as we consolidate and pool our power, as we understand our linked fate as workers, we'll be able to mount the type of effective strength to fight back nationally and internationally against the global elites and really put pressure on them and see a day when we win, right? It's not enough to fight discrimination because that's not the antithesis to capitalism, right? The antithesis to capitalism is socialism, right? So understanding our linked fate as workers, providing an alternative to a capitalist political economy, communist and socialist world in which workers benefit, from their labor, and we're not viciously divided, fighting each other, is what we're out to propose tonight. Yeah, so I think I'm cool to kind of just like pause there. I'll kick it over to Anton and let him kind of further elaborate, and then I look forward to engaging you all via question. Yeah.
So, as Demetrius was saying, that the topic is solidarity, and if you say the word solidarity in the context of anti-racist activism these days, you're very likely to be taken for some kind of hippie. In the minds of a lot of people, the word solidarity evokes the 1971 Coca-Cola commercial, with 100 or so multicultural teenagers hold hands at a California hilltop and sing "I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony." That's the connotation, I think, that the word has in the movement today. And what's much more common than talking about solidarity is talking about allyship and an associated discourse of privilege. And this goes hand in hand with something that I'm sure will be familiar to everyone in the room, a certain segregation within the movement. It's generally expected that white people are going to organize, white people, black people, women organize, so on and so forth. The ISO stands in a different political tradition, a tradition that emphasizes or speaks not so much of privilege but of solidarity. And the main question I want to address is, if this is not just some hippie ideal, what is it? And how is it different from this more familiar politics of privilege and allyship? In thinking about this question, I think it's helpful to turn first to the black abolitionist and former slave Frederick Douglass. In a letter arguing that blacks in the South should have the right to vote, Douglass wrote, "The hostility between the whites and blacks of the South is easily explained. It has its root in sap in the relation of slavery, and was incited on both sides by the cunning of the slave masters. Those masters secured their ascendancy over both the poor whites and the blacks by putting enmity between them. They divided both to conquer each." Now, Douglass was not a hippie. He didn't underestimate the suffering of black people. He didn't underestimate the virulence of anti-black racism or the difficulty of overcoming it. But he saw that the racial animosity and racial oppression of his time were part of a larger dynamic. They weren't self-standing phenomena. In particular, he saw that they played an instrumental role in the process by which a tiny class of people secured its ascendancy over everyone else, white and black. Now, it was obvious to everybody, as was Douglas, he doesn't really mention it, it was obvious to everyone that the poor whites in the South enjoyed certain advantages or privileges, if you like, relative to their poor black counterparts. This went without saying. The letter I was quoting was the letter arguing that blacks should be given the right to vote. But Douglas saw something that was not so obvious, namely that poor white people would be better off without those privileges. Were there privileges? Yes. They'd be better off without them. Because it was precisely that system of privilege or advantage or relative benefit that prevented poor whites and poor blacks from standing shoulder to shoulder and facing their common enemy. That was his position. He wrote, the slaveholders, with a craftiness peculiar to themselves, by encouraging the enmity of the poor laboring white man against the blacks, succeeded in making said white man almost as much of a slave as the black himself. Both are plundered by the same plunderer. Now the plunderers that he was talking about, the slave owners, they were white. So there was a group of white people who benefited from the existence of white supremacy, no doubt. But Douglas was emphasizing this was a small fraction of the white people in the South. Douglas saw that there were differences of class among the white people around him. Well, a small minority of them, the slave owners, had an interest in preserving white supremacy. The majority of them, who were poor, had an interest in destroying the white supremacy. So the majority of whites who had an interest in destroying white supremacy shared that interest with all black people. Douglas understood that there was a certain way that someone like him was supposed to think about the structure of his society. Someone like him was supposed to think that the really deep and important division within his society was between white people and black people. So that the whites were all on one side and had one set of interests. The blacks were all on the other side and they had another set of interests. Douglas saw that this was a false conception of the structure of his society, and that it was not just false, it was a deception. It was a deception perpetrated by the wealthy white slave owners for the express purpose of subjugating everyone else, whether white or black. Now, the Marxist term for this kind of subterfuge is ideology. This is one of the things that that term can apply to. Marx famously claimed that the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, and Douglas's analysis of his society provides a perfect illustration of what Marx meant by that. The prevailing idea in Douglas's time, the one that he was conveying against in the quotations I read, the idea that poor white people had more in common with wealthy white people than they had in common with poor black people. This idea was a useful untruth. Now, who was it useful to? It was useful to the wealthy white slave owners. It was an idea of the ruling class in the sense that its circulation served an important function in sustaining the power of that slave owners exercised over everyone else. It was a ruling idea in the sense that it was an idea that enabled the rulers to rule. But notice that the crucial untruth, as Frederick Douglass saw it, was an idea that most people, or not very many people today, would accept. Namely, that most white people benefit from white supremacy. That's a very common idea amongst people who are against racism. And if you think that, then that's going to inform what you think needs to be done to overcome racism. But that idea, according to Frederick Douglass, is a useful lie perpetrated by people who divide us so that we can't join arm in arm against our real enemy. Now, it might seem hyperbolic or metaphorical to claim that we can be ruled by ideas, but in fact it's not, I think. If you think about it, there are really just two main ways of subordinating people. One is to threaten them, and the other is to pit them against each other. The success of the first method requires that the victims understand what's happening to them. The success of the second method requires that they misunderstand what's happening. So insofar as I'm threatening you, I need you to understand that you are being threatened. If I say to you, your money or your life, but I don't enunciate, and you think I said, your mom looks like your wife, or something, then I'm not going to successfully threaten you, and I'm not going to get what I want. If I'm going to succeed, you must understand what I'm trying to do to you. I need threatening. Otherwise, you're not going to do what I want. But it's different with the other method. In order to gain the upper hand over a group of people by sowing division among them, it is imperative that they not understand what is happening to them. They need to be in the dark about the dynamic that's at work. This is so for an obvious reason. If they understood that they were being pitted against each other, then they would also see that they have a common interest in joining against whoever is pitting them against each other. So the misunderstanding of the situation is essential to the success of that method of subordinating. To act in solidarity is to act from the recognition that you have been pitted against someone who is not your enemy by someone else who is. I think that's the fundamental idea. It's a matter of perceiving an attempt to divide and conquer, and of acting on this perception in the only rational way, by joining forces so far as possible with those from whom one would otherwise be divided. So understood, solidarity is not, to act in solidarity is not to act in a selfless way. It's not a matter of coming to someone's rescue. A man who opposes the oppression of women out of solidarity does not do so only because the oppression of women is bad for women, but also because it's bad for men. A native-born worker who opposes the hyper-exploitation of immigrant workers out of solidarity does not do so only because the hyper-exploitation of immigrant workers is bad for immigrant workers, but also because it is bad for native-born. It's not selfish. It's not an act of charity. It's not an act of brotherly love. That's supposed to be an act that doesn't involve doing what's in your own interest. And that's the point. I think this is maybe the place to contrast solidarity so conceived with the idea of privilege, or a politics based on the idea of privilege. By way of thinking about the question whether, for example, white people are privileged in a white supremacist society, or whether men are privileged in a patriarchal society. I think that from the perspective of if privilege is the only idea, political concept that you're operating with, you're not in a position to understand the kind of position that Frederick Douglass was describing. Because, look, the answer whether the poor black people that Douglas was talking about enjoyed privileges relative to their poor white counterparts is obviously yes. I mean, that obviously. But asking whether somebody's privileged is like asking whether somebody's taller. It just doesn't make sense. Are you taller? Taller than who? Taller than what? So you can be privileged relative to, say a man can be privileged relative to his female counterpart in a sexist society such as ours. But does he enjoy privilege because there is patriarchy? Well, to answer that question, you have to consider his position relative to what his position would be without patriarchy. Or again, like, do white people benefit from racism? Well, if you're asking whether a white worker benefits relative to his or her, working class black counterpart, the answer is clearly yes. Otherwise, there would be no point talking about racial oppression. But do they benefit relative to their own position, absent racism? No, or at least that was Frederick Douglass's position. So it depends on what you're talking about. It's a relative question, and it requires a relative answer. So that's how it's possible to say what Frederick Douglass was saying. Obviously, white people enjoy privileges, poor white people enjoy privileges relative to poor black people. Nevertheless, poor white people would be better off if they didn't have those privileges. Both things are possible. So, do white people benefit from slavery? Yes and no. Both. But the idea of a privileged politics only really puts you in a position to understand one of those, and not the deepest one, or not the deepest one on view of Frederick Douglass that I was articulating before. So now it goes without saying, I hope that the lines along which people are pitted against each other need to be racial. They can be lines of gender, of sexuality, or religion. They can be national borders, so that workers in the U.S. are pitted against foreign-born workers or workers that are still living abroad, native-born workers versus immigrants. And under capitalism, each individual worker is pitted against every other worker in the competition for jobs. But seeing this competition and this pitting of one of us against the others of us is crucial for understanding solidarity, and it's the pervasiveness of this structure that explains why solidarity is the cornerstone of Marxist politics. It's instructive to consider what Douglass says about white and black workers in the southern United States to what Marx wrote at about the same time, a couple years earlier, about English and Irish workers in England. Quote, this is Marx, "All English industrial and commercial centers now possess a working class split into two hostile camps, English proletarians and Irish proletarians. The ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker because he sees in him a competitor who lowers his standard of life. Compared with the Irish worker, he feels himself a member of the ruling nation, and for this very reason he makes himself into a tool of the aristocrats and capitalists against Ireland, and thus strengthens their dominion over himself. His attitude towards the Irish worker is much the same as that of the poor whites to the Negroes in the former slave states of the United States. The Irishman pays him back with interest in his own money. He sees in the English worker both the accomplice and the stupid tool of English rule in Ireland. This antagonism is artificially sustained and intensified by the press, by the pulpit, by the comment papers, in short, by all the means at the disposal of the ruling classes. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class, despite its organization. It is the secret which enables the capitalist class to maintain its power, as this class is perfectly aware." Expressing his support for the North in the Civil War, Marx would later write Capital, "In the United States of America, every independent movement of the workers was paralyzed as long as slavery disfigured a part of the Republic. Labor cannot emancipate itself in the white skin wherein the black is branded. Even today, labor in the black skin is branded. Black people are branded in a way that is useful to, and because it is useful to, for no other reason than that it is useful to, a tiny class of people who control control the vast wealth of our society, and who therefore control the things that all of us need for a decent life. The branding of black people is useful to this tiny class of society for exactly the same reason that Frederick Douglass identified, because it pits labor in white skin against labor in black skin. There is therefore a very close relation between racism and capitalism. This relation is often mentioned, but I think it's often misdescribed when people say that racism is a byproduct of capitalism. This formulation is intended to convey that they're inextricably linked somehow, but I think it's important that we get clearly in view what kind of link it is. The problem with thinking of racism as a byproduct of capitalism is that a byproduct serves no purpose in the process of which it is a byproduct. For example, if in order to make a house, you saw a board in half, then inevitably you're going to make a little sawdust. Here, the product of labor is a house, and the sawdust is a mere byproduct. That is, the sawdust is an incidental side effect whose production, though perhaps unavoidable, serves no purpose. In the reproduction of capitalism, racism is not the sawdust. It's the saw. It's a tool used by the working class to divide the rest of us. And unlike any byproduct, it has a definite function. That's why any clear-eyed anti-capitalism must be anti-racist. The same can be said about sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and other forms of oppression. Any form of anti-capitalism must oppose every form of oppression, because every form of oppression is a means, a tool by which people with a shared interest are divided. If the ruling class uses racism and other forms of oppression to pit us against each other for the sake of extracting profits from us, then there's a definite order of ends and means, and this order is also important to recognize. Racism is the means. Profit is the end, not vice versa. Capitalism does not exist for the sake of racism. People aren't out there making money so that they can abuse black people. That's not the way it goes. It goes the other way. Racism exists for the sake of capitalism, fighting capitalism. Every blow struck against white supremacy, or against sexism, or transphobia, or homophobia, Islamophobia, damages a tool of the ruling class, and is therefore a blow against that class. Now, this is not to say that the only thing wrong with racism or any other form of oppression is the instrumental role it plays in sustaining capitalism. Global capitalism was suddenly overthrown in a socialist revolution, and it's clear that the cultural and psychological effects of centuries of racialized and gendered violence would not disappear on their own. Their eradication would require a tremendous concerted effort. But one very important thing would be different after capitalism was gone. Racism would have lost its reason for being. The system of exploitation that calls it into existence day after day, and sustains it in place. This system would no longer be there to sustain it in place. Racism would no longer have any work to do in the reproduction of human life. And that would make the task of addressing the cultural and psychological infrastructure of white supremacy much different and much more tractable than it is today. And that's why any clear-eyed anti-racism must be anti-capitalist. So, why do socialists argue that the struggle against oppression and exploitation should be rooted in the solidarity of working class people? Not for any reason other than that's what's necessary for us to win. There's no other good way of arguing for a politics, I think. If somebody wants to argue for the superiority of privileged politics, then they need to show, the argument needs to have this form. This is how we win. If it doesn't have that form, it's out. So the politics of solidarity is based not on a warm feeling, but on a sober analysis of the shit we're in and on a calculation about how to get out of it. The analysis, the first part of the analysis is that we, ordinary people of no matter what race, who work for a living or who are expected to do so, and who, if we are lucky enough to earn a paycheck, live from one paycheck to the next, we, all of us, have a common enemy who is plundering us all. A tiny class of people who control the vast wealth of our society and who therefore control all the things we need for a decent life. Things like healthy food, education, medical care, leisure time, freedom from debt, an undestroyed environment, and not being killed by the poor. The second plank of the analysis is that this tiny class of people is able to plunder us largely because it is able to prevent us from appreciating our common interest in removing them. The calculation is that they are powerful, and the only way we are powerful enough to remove them is by working together. Because we're many and they're few, we must not allow ourselves to be pitted against each other. We have to fight against every form of oppression, because any form of oppression divides our strength and is an obstacle to us. If you just took all of us as we are and just dropped us into an imaginary social utopia with all of our ideas being the way they are, a mix of really good and bad, all of us, that's not going to work out. That's not going to go anywhere. Everybody knows it. So the question is, how do all of our, we've got to go through this process. We've got to win it for ourselves, because in the process of figuring it out together and emancipating ourselves, that we change on a massive scale and become fit to live in some other way. Because it's a real question, how could we as we are ever live together in a way that's deeper than how screwed up we are? And I think that's it. It's the struggle itself which has to be which has big implications for how we organize. It means that we need to bring as many people into the struggle as possible. That is, we need massive movements. Not little movements of people who are already woke and already know everything, are already way ahead and already wondering where everyone else is. No. If what I was just saying is true, we need these movements to be massive, and that means we need to invite people who are not yet part of it in. And that means we need to make allowances for the fact that they, like we, have all sorts of mixed up ideas. That doesn't mean making excuses for them or anything else, but it means recognizing that that's just inevitable. What do you expect? I mean, were you born a radical? I wasn't. That's how we need people who are not yet radical to become radical on a massive scale. And so, we need to organize with a view to making that possible. And for that precise reason, so that consciousness can change. Gender.
What to say right now, in terms of closing, I feel like a lot has been said. A lot of valuable things have been contributed tonight. Just piggyback on that, I think the challenge now is to get involved. So some immediate events or some events coming up in the immediate future, in which you can join folks who are committed to struggling against the system. And to Steve's point, organizing for what, right? We're organizing for socialism. We can do better than capitalism, and that is a fundamental starting point for us, and we're willing to grind and work it out. I think this whole thing, what we're talking about tonight, ideological struggle, is it's probably important to keep in mind. It's not an easy thing, right? It's tough to get in a room with folks and really confront them and battle, over ideas, right? But it's necessary, right? And so I think it's important to hold each other accountable in love, be ruthless in our critiques in love, with the thought that we can win people over, right? This is a superior position that we hold, because it's the one that's going to enable us to win. It's the one that's going to enable us to create the world that's possible, right? That we can fashion. So, yeah.
There's one question that was still lingering that I feel like didn't get addressed that Alex raised, and that was what does solidarity look like? I do think it's important to know when we see it. Not only so that we know it's possible and real and like a real force, but so that we know what to aim for. And I think that we've seen some of it in recent months. I mean, after the inauguration, it's important to remember that there were 4 million people protesting. Were they all socialists and revolutionaries? No, but we're starting from where we are, and this is what it looks like at first on a massive scale. That's what it begins to look like, and that's a really important sign. I mean, what did it look like? What does it look like? It looked like the thing that happened the next week, when after the Muslim ban was put out by Trump, and spontaneously within hours, tens of thousands of people were at airports demonstrating. They weren't all from 7 countries named or from Mexico. There was a lot of stuff, and also we should recognize that part of the reason that could happen like that was because there had just been 4 million people in the streets a week before. And one of the really, I think, important parts of what happened on that night, the night of the protest at the airport, was the New York City taxi driver strike, which was actually the largest part of that demonstration in a sense, because it involved tens of thousands of workers who were on strike only for an hour. But it was a big deal for an hour. Like if you shut down JFK International Airport for an hour, they didn't shut it down. But if you did, that would really be felt around the world. So, I mean, what part of what was important about that is, first of all, the statement they put out, which was all about solidarity, which recognized that, first of all, this wasn't merely a working issue. They weren't striking for an hour over their wages or working conditions, but they were partly striking about their working conditions, because as they said in that statement, Islamophobia puts our lives at risk when we drive cars. But it doesn't just put our lives at risk, it puts at risk anyone who could be mistaken for a Muslim, frankly. But it also, I think, reminded us of what the working class looks like. Because in a lot of the post-election discourse, we have white working class. But look, you want to know what the working class looks like? The working class looks like people who work at JFK. Taxi drivers, baggage handlers, restaurant workers, janitorial staff. That's the working class. And imagine if all of the people at JFK went on strike for 1 hour and shut it, or for one evening. Like that's why we look to the working class. We don't look. This is another important difference between socialist politics and privileged politics. We don't focus on the working. Like when we talk about the working class, It's not because we think the working class is the most oppressed group of people in the world. That's not why. We're not trying to find the people who are suffering the most. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for the people who can do the most, who have the most power. And when you think about what could be done just by the people working at JFK in an afternoon, you see what the kind of power that belongs to ordinary people if organized. And that's why it's important to, I think, put working class solidarity at the